The air in the room was cold, sterile, and heavy with the crushing weight of the United States government. On one side, a phalanx of silent, dark-suited lawyers from the Department of Justice, the Treasury, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. They were the hunters, the embodiment of a global superpower's wrath, and they had finally cornered their prey. On the other side sat one man, the architect of a financial revolution. Changpeng Zhao, known to the world simply as CP. He was the founder and CEO of Binance, the largest cryptocurrency exchange on the planet, an empire he had built from nothing for years. He had been a ghost, a titan who operated in the digital ether, seemingly beyond the reach of any single nation. But now, he was here, in a featureless room in Seattle, the hub of a system he had sought to make obsolete. The silence was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at him. Every tick of the clock was a reminder of the colossal power he was now facing. For years, his mantra had been growth over all else. His internal motto was infamous, a guiding principle that had made him a billionaire but had also led him to this very room. It was, as he'd told his employees, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. That philosophy had built an exchange that processed trillions of dollars in trades, a platform that gave financial access to millions. But it had also, according to the stone-faced prosecutors before him, opened the floodgates for criminals, terrorists, and sanctioned states. Then, one of the figures across the table, a prosecutor from the Justice Department's National Security Division, leaned forward, breaking the suffocating quiet. His voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical instrument of the law. He looked directly at the crypto king, a man who commanded a multi-billion-dollar fortune, and delivered the line that would shatter the myth of CZ. Mr. Zhao, the voice cut through the tension. Your company's strategy of putting profits over compliance isn't a path to riches. It's a path to federal prosecution. You willfully turned a blind eye, and in doing so, you allowed money to flow to terrorists, to cybercriminals, and to child abusers through your platform. The accusation hung in the air, dense and suffocating. This wasn't just about breaking financial rules. This was an allegation that Binance had become a laundromat for the world's most dangerous actors. US officials claimed the company had deliberately looked the other way as illicit actors conducted transactions supporting child sex abuse, the illegal drug trade, and terrorist groups. The government alleged that Binance had processed nearly $900 million in transactions between Americans and users and sanctioned Iran, and had willfully failed to report over 100,000 suspicious transactions, including those with designated terrorist organizations like Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. The words were a kill shot, designed to dismantle not just the company, but the man. In that moment, Changpeng Zhao was no longer the trailblazing disruptor of finance. He was a criminal defendant facing the full, unblinking might of American law. What happened next, the decisions made in the wake of that crushing accusation, would not only decide his fate and the future of his massive empire, but would send a shockwave through the entire world of cryptocurrency, a world that would be forever altered. This is the story of how the most powerful man in crypto was brought to his knees, and the secret network of power and influence that both built him up and tore him down. Before we dive into this incredible confrontation, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these explosive political moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. To understand the scale of this confrontation, you must first understand the titans who entered the ring. This wasn't just a company versus a country. It was a battle of two opposing faiths, embodied by two radically different figures. On one side stood Changpeng Zhao, the man they called CZ. He wasn't a CEO in the traditional sense. He was a symbol, a digital prophet for a new age of finance. To his millions of followers, he was the humble genius in a black Binance hoodie, a man who had democratized wealth and offered a way out of a rigged financial system. His public persona was one of serene confidence and unwavering belief in the power of crypto. He lived on social media, communicating directly with his flock through cryptic tweets and reassurances. His most famous signal was the number 4, a simple command to his followers to ignore what he called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It was a powerful tool, a way to dismiss any criticism, any negative news story, any government warning, as nothing more than the desperate noise of a dying establishment. But behind this carefully crafted image of a humble servant of the crypto revolution was a story of relentless ambition. Born in China, his family fled the country in the late 1980s after his father, a university professor, was branded a pro-bourgeois intellectual and exiled. They landed in Vancouver, Canada, where the young Zhao worked at McDonald's and gas stations to help make ends meet. This was the classic immigrant story of grit and determination, the foundation of the CZ myth. He studied computer science and, for a time, followed a conventional path, building high-frequency trading systems for the very financial institutions he would later seek to dismantle. But the old world was too slow, too constrained by rules and borders. When he discovered Bitcoin in 2013, he saw the future. He went all in, selling his apartment to buy his first stash of digital coins. His true genius, however, was not in simply recognizing the potential of crypto, but in understanding how to exploit the regulatory vacuum that surrounded it. When he launched Binance in 2017, he didn't just build an exchange, he built a fortress of corporate ambiguity. For years, if you asked where Binance was headquartered, you would get a deflective answer. It was a decentralized company, CZ would claim, an entity that existed in the cloud, belonging to no single jurisdiction and therefore, in his view, subject to none. This was a deliberate, calculated strategy. He moved his company and his employees from China to Japan, then to Malta, constantly staying one step ahead of regulators. He built a ghost ship that sailed the world's financial seas, flying no nation's flag and obeying no nation's laws. His prime directive, the one that echoed through internal company chats, was growth. His personal motto, now infamous, was that it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission. This philosophy fueled an explosive expansion that saw they become the largest exchange on earth within 180 days. He was the king of a borderless kingdom, a man who could move markets with a single tweet, whose personal fortune soared into the tens of billions. He saw himself as a visionary, building a new, more efficient financial system for the world. But the US government saw something else entirely. They saw the charismatic leader of the world's largest unlicensed money transmitter. Opposing him was an entity of a completely different nature. It wasn't one person, but a hydra-headed leviathan, the United States government. This was the old guard, the global empire, the architect and defender of the very financial system CZ sought to append, where CZ was agile, charismatic, and operated in the open glare of social media. The government was methodical, silent, and anonymous. It moved from the shadows of imposing federal buildings in Washington, D.C., a vast and faceless bureaucracy that possessed a power CZ could never truly comprehend. It didn't need a hoodie or a catchy slogan. Its symbol was the seal of the United States, and its authority was backed by the world's largest economy and its most formidable military. The government didn't see a visionary, it saw a colossal threat to national security and the stability of the global financial order. The hunt for Binance wasn't the work of a single rogue prosecutor. It was a coordinated multi-year assault, waged by the most powerful arms of American law and finance, a quiet and patient crusade to bring the crypto king to heel. First, there was the Department of Justice, the DOJ, the ultimate enforcer of American law. The investigation was spearheaded by its most elite and feared divisions, the National Security Division, the arm of the DOJ responsible for hunting terrorists and countering foreign espionage, saw Binance not as a financial innovator, but as a dangerous tool in the hands of America's enemies. They were the ones who traced the flow of funds to groups like Hamas and Al-Qaeda, viewing the exchange as a critical node in the global terror finance network. Working alongside them were the bloodhounds from the criminal division's money laundering and asset recovery section. These are the world's foremost financial detectives, experts at untangling complex webs of shell companies and illicit transactions. For them, Binance was the single largest money laundering operation they had ever encountered, an unlicensed money transmitting business that had willingly opened its doors to narco traffickers, cybercriminals, and kleptocrats. Their goal was simple and brutal: to build an ironclad criminal case, dismantle the operation, and put Changpeng Zhao himself in a federal prison cell. Then came the Department of the Treasury, the guardian of the American dollar and the global financial system it underpins. Two of its most potent agencies were at the forefront of the attack. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FINCEN, is the entity that writes and enforces the anti-money laundering rules that are the absolute bedrock of modern banking. FINCEN viewed Binance's entire business model as a flagrant assault on the Bank Secrecy Act, the foundational law designed to prevent the financial system from being used for illicit purposes. They saw a black hole, an offshore casino where hundreds of billions of dollars flowed with virtually no oversight, no reporting of suspicious activity, and no accountability. Alongside them was the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, the agency that wields one of America's most powerful non-military weapons, economic sanctions. When OFAC places a person, company, or country on its blacklist, they are effectively excommunicated from the US dollar, the lifeblood of international commerce. OFAC watched with mounting fury as Binance allegedly processed nearly $1 billion in transactions between American users and those in sanctioned Iran, creating a financial superhighway for a hostile regime to bypass America's most critical foreign policy tool. For the Treasury, this was not just a matter of rule-breaking, it was an act of economic warfare against the United States. Finally, completing this iron triangle of enforcement was the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, the powerful regulator of the vast and complex American derivatives markets. While the DOJ pursued criminal charges and the Treasury wielded sanctions, the CFTC launched a civil assault that was, in many ways, the most devastating blow of all. Their lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal warfare, a document that ripped away the curtain of CZ's carefully constructed public image and exposed the raw, unfiltered reality of how Binance truly operated. The CFTC's filing was not based on abstract allegations. It was built on a foundation of Binance's own internal communications, a treasure trove of damning emails and chat logs that painted a shocking picture of deliberate deception. The CFT argued that Binance was not merely a simple currency exchange but a massive, unregistered derivatives platform that had been actively and illegally soliciting American customers for years, all while publicly claiming to block them. The lawsuit read like a script from a corporate thriller. It quoted senior Binance executives, including CZ himself, appearing to mock their own compliance efforts and brainstorm ways to help lucrative American traders, so-called via, circumvent the company's flimsy controls. In one now infamous chat log, Binance's former chief compliance officer allegedly wrote to a colleague, "We are operating as a fucking unlicensed securities exchange in the USA, bro." In another, he admitted that the company's compliance program was a sham, designed to look like we are in control. The documents showed CZ himself being alerted that terrorist groups were transacting on the platform, and being warned about the presence of criminals, yet pushing for growth above all else. This evidence directly contradicted his public persona as the serene leader guided by principle. It shattered the foremyth, replacing the image of a visionary with a portrait of a CEO who was allegedly willing to say anything in public while allowing a culture of flagrant law-breaking to fester in private. These three agencies, the DOJ with its criminal hammer, the Treasury with its economic chokehold, and the CFTC with its scalpel of civil litigation, formed a unified front. They were not just separate agencies pursuing individual cases. They were a coordinated force, sharing information and tightening the net from all sides. They represented the full, terrifying might of the established order. This was the clash of archetypes. The new money tech messiah who believed code was law, against the old world sovereign who knew that, in the end, true power came from the state's ability to enforce its laws with overwhelming and inexorable force. The stage was set for a battle that would define an entire industry. This confrontation was never just about one man or one company breaking the rules. To see it that way is to miss the colossal, history-shaping conflict that was truly at play. This was a war for the future of money itself. It was a battle over the fundamental question of who gets to write the rules in the 21st century. The decentralized, borderless world of code, or the centralized, sovereign power of the nations. The takedown of Changpeng Zhao and Binance was the moment the United States government drew a line in the digital sand and declared that its power did not end where the internet began. This was a fight for the soul of the global financial system. For over a decade, the promise of cryptocurrency had been a revolutionary siren song. It was pitched as a great liberation, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to break free from the shackles of the old world order. The existing system prophets preached was slow, inefficient, and fundamentally unfair. It was a world controlled by gatekeepers, by big banks on Wall Street and powerful central bankers in Washington, London, and Brussels. They could freeze your assets, devalue your currency, and cut you off from the system at a whim. Crypto was the answer. It offered a parallel universe of finance, one built on mathematics and cryptography, not on the decrees of politicians or the whims of bankers. It was a system that was open to everyone, regardless of their nationality or wealth. It promised true financial sovereignty, and no one embodied that promise more powerfully than Changpeng Zhao. Binance was more than just a marketplace for Bitcoin and other digital coins. It was the ultimate expression of this revolutionary dream. It was fast, it was cheap, and, most importantly, it was everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a one-stop shop for a new financial reality, offering trading, lending, saving, and wealth creation tools that directly rivaled the largest banks on earth, but without any of the regulatory burdens. This wasn't just innovation in the eye of the US government, it was a full frontal assault. They saw a shadow financial system growing at an exponential rate, completely outside of their control and visibility. A system that, by its very design, threatened the core pillars of American power. The first threat was existential, a challenge to the supremacy of the US dollar. For decades, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency has been the bedrock of American global influence. It allows the US to borrow cheaply, to impose powerful sanctions, and to project its economic might across the planet. A globally adopted, decentralized currency operating outside of this system would be a dagger aimed at the heart of that power. Secondly, and more immediately, this shadow system posed a catastrophic threat to national security. An anonymous, borderless financial network is the ultimate fantasy for terrorist financiers, narco-states, rogue regimes, and cybercriminals. It's a tailor-made tool for washing dirty money and evading the law. Officials in Washington watched in horror as Binance allegedly became a financial superhighway for America's most dangerous adversaries. The battle against Binance, therefore, became a proxy war. By targeting the largest and most powerful player in the crypto ecosystem, the United States wasn't just enforcing banking laws, it was defending its sovereignty. It was a declaration that the foundational powers of a state, the power to control currency, to enforce laws, and to protect its people, would be asserted with overwhelming force. Even in the digital realm, the stakes were just as high for the crypto world itself. The investigation into Binance became a moment of existential reckoning for the entire industry. For years, crypto had thrived in a state of glorious ambiguity, a Wild West where fortunes were made overnight and the old rules simply didn't seem to apply. This lawlessness was not a bug, it was a feature. It was what attracted the risk-takers, the visionaries, and the true believers who were convinced they were building a better world. But it also attracted charlatans, grifters, and, as the government alleged, criminals of the highest order. The industry was plagued by spectacular collapses. From the implosion of the Terra Luna ecosystem to the shocking fraud of Sam Bankman, FTX, a key rival to Binance, each disaster eroded public trust and intensified the pressure on regulators to act. The FTX scandal, in particular, was a turning point. Bankman-Fried had played the game in Washington, donating millions to political campaigns and testifying before Congress, presenting himself as the responsible face of crypto. His sudden, catastrophic downfall revealed a level of rot and deception that stunned the world and left regulators looking asleep at the wheel. They could not afford another such failure. The political pressure to tame the industry became immense. In this superheated environment, Binance, being the largest and most globally significant player, was the ultimate target. Taking down Binance was no longer just an option. It was a political and regulatory necessity. It was the government's chance to prove it was still in charge, to restore order, and to send an unmistakable message to the entire digital asset industry. The party is over. This was a clash of historical narratives. In one telling, this was the story of a visionary entrepreneur being persecuted by a sclerotic and jealous establishment, afraid of being made obsolete. It was a classic tale of David versus Goliath, the innovator against the empire. But in the government's telling, this was a story about the rule of law. It was about whether the foundational principles of a society that no one is above the law, that rules exist to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, and that a nation has the right to defend itself from those who would fund its enemies still held true in the digital age. The government saw the fight against Binance as a direct continuation of the lessons learned from the 2008 financial crisis. A decade earlier, the world had watched as complex, unregulated financial instruments created by the world's biggest banks brought the global economy to its knees. Regulators had been too slow, too trusting, and too captured by the industry they were supposed to police. The result was a devastating crisis followed by massive bailouts, creating a deep and lasting public rage that fueled populist movements on both the left and the right. That crisis was the fertile ground from which crypto's anti-establishment message grew. Now faced with a new, even more opaque and borderless financial system, the government was determined not to make the same mistake twice. This time, they would not wait for a collapse. They would act preemptively and decisively to neutralize the threat. The stakes, therefore, could not have been higher. For CZ, it was a fight for his freedom, his fortune, and his legacy. For Binance, it was a fight for its very survival. And for the United States government, it was a fight to assert its ultimate authority and to decide who would write the rules for the 21st century economy. The confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when, and the world was about to see what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The first shots in this war were not fired from Washington, D.C., but from the screen of Changpeng Zhao's own smartphone. As the whispers of a sprawling U.S. government investigation grew into a deafening roar, CZ launched the only kind of counteroffensive he knew. It was an attack composed of tweets, blog posts, and media interviews, a public relations blitz designed to control the narrative and rally his millions of followers to his side. His strategy was simple, audacious, and ultimately fatally flawed. He would treat the United States government like any other critic. He would dismiss them as spreaders of FUD. With every new leak about a DOJ probe or a Treasury investigation, CZ or his lieutenants would appear serene and unbothered, to reassure the market. The allegations were baseless, they insisted. They were the product of jealous rivals, of a biased media, of an old guard terrified of the future. The ultimate weapon in this PR war was the number. 4. It became a digital battle standard. When Reuters published a bombshell report detailing Binance's weak anti-money laundering controls, CZ would tweet 4, and an army of loyal followers would flood social media, drowning out the report with accusations of FUD. When rumors swirled that prosecutors were considering filing criminal charges, the official Binance blog would publish a lengthy post about their commitment to compliance, concluding with a call to ignore the FUD. It was a powerful and effective tactic for a time. It created an echo chamber, a reality distortion field, where Binance was the victim and the government was the aggressor. To the outside world, it looked like arrogance. Here was a man, facing the most powerful law enforcement apparatus on the planet, responding to meticulously documented allegations with a single-digit meme. It was the digital equivalent of sticking his fingers in his ears and singing la la la. Behind the scenes, Binance executed a more sophisticated, though equally theatrical, line of defense. They went on a hiring spree, bringing in a small army of former regulators and law enforcement officials from the very agencies that were now investigating them. They hired former IRS criminal investigators, former FBI agents, and even former Treasury officials. On paper, it was a masterstroke. It was meant to signal a new era of maturity and a serious commitment to compliance. The company would parade these new hires in press releases and at industry conferences, showcasing them like trophies. See, they were saying, "We are one of you now. We are legitimate. We are serious." But internal communications, later revealed in court filings, suggested a different reality. These compliance efforts were allegedly seen by some insiders as a facade, a public relations tool to placate banks and regulators, a check-the-box exercise that shouldn't get in the way of the real business, explosive, uninhibited growth. The strategy was to create the appearance of compliance, a carefully crafted illusion that they hoped would be enough to keep the regulators at bay. This was CZ's great miscalculation. He believed he was in a battle for public opinion, that if he could convince his followers and the market that he was in the right, the government would eventually back down. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his opponent. The Department of Justice does not care about Twitter polls. The Treasury Department is not swayed by blog posts. The CFTC is not intimidated by memes. While CZ was fighting a war of words in the open, the government was waging a war of evidence in the shadows. They were quietly gathering documents, subpoenaing witnesses, flipping insiders, and painstakingly building a case so massive and so airtight that no amount of public relations could refute it. The fatal flaw in CZ's attack was that he brought a narrative to a fight that would be decided by facts, and the government had all the facts. The first hammer blow of this reality came not as a criminal indictment, but as a civil complaint from the CFTC, and it contained the receipts. The takedown was a masterclass in methodical, soul-crushing pressure. It began not with a SWAT team raid, but with the quiet electronic filing of a 74-page document. On March 27, 2023, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission dropped its civil complaint, and it landed in the crypto world with the force of a nuclear bomb. This document was the government's opening salvo, and it was devastating because it was constructed almost entirely from Binance's own words. The investigators had unearthed a treasure trove of internal emails, chat logs, and documents that laid bare the company's inner workings. It was a takedown by 1,000 receipts. The CFTC complaint systematically dismantled the public image CZ had so carefully cultivated. It was a guided missile aimed directly at the heart of his credibility. The first receipt was the bombshell admission from Binance's own chief compliance officer, a man named Samuel Lim. In a chat log from 2020, discussing the company's operations, Lim wrote to a colleague the now infamous line, "We are operating as a FING unlicensed securities exchange in the USA, bro." In another chat, when discussing the illicit activities of some clients, he appeared to admit that terrorists usually send small sums as large sums constitute money laundering. These weren't accusations from a biased journalist. This was the head of compliance himself admitting, in writing, that the company was breaking the law and seemingly discussing how to manage criminal clients. The FUD defense was instantly incinerated. How could CZ tell his followers to ignore fear and uncertainty when the fear and uncertainty were coming from inside his own house? The second receipt targeted the lie that Binance had left the United States. The complaint detailed, with excruciating precision, how Binance and CZ had publicly claimed to have blocked US users, while privately doing everything in their power to keep them on the platform. The government had logs showing executives devising strategies to help their most lucrative American clients, their VIPs, sidestep the weak compliance controls. They would allegedly be instructed to re-register through offshore shell companies, to hide their American origins. The complaint even quoted CZ himself from an internal chat, where he wrote that while Binance had to publicly claim to block US users, they should find a creative way to keep them. This wasn't just a failure of compliance. This was evidence of a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to deceive regulators and the public, seemingly directed from the very top. The third, and perhaps most damning receipt, was the evidence that this was not a rogue operation. Changpeng Zhao was presented not as an out-of-arch leader, but as the central architect of this entire scheme. The complaint showed he was regularly informed of the company's significant US presence and revenue streams. It demonstrated his deep involvement in the day-to-day decisions aimed at maximizing growth over compliance. The document alleged that, while CZ was on a mission to onboard the next billion users, he was fostering a corporate culture where profits were the only metric that truly mattered. This filing changed everything. It provided the script for every news report, every government statement, every enemy attack that would follow. It was the irrefutable proof that pierced the veil of CZ's carefully constructed reality. The takedown was no longer a matter of rumor and speculation. It was now a matter of public record. And this was only the beginning. The CFTC was just the opening act. The main event, the criminal indictment from the Department of Justice, was still to come. The boa constrictor of American law was slowly, methodically tightening its grip, and now it was becoming clear that there was no escape. With the CFTC complaint acting as the official declaration of war, the real takedown began. It was a silent, suffocating siege. While the crypto world was still reeling from the shock of the internal chat logs, the Department of Justice and the Treasury were preparing the final, decisive assault. This phase of the confrontation was a war of nerves, a battle fought not on Twitter, but through back-channel negotiations between Binance's high-priced lawyers and stony-faced federal prosecutors. The government's strategy was brutally effective. They would leak just enough information to let CZ know the full extent of the evidence they held, making it clear that the initial CFTC filing was just a gentle preview of the horror show to come. The most terrifying threat came from the DOJ's National Security Division. The case had evolved far beyond a mere financial crime. It was now a matter of national security. Prosecutors let it be known that they had compiled overwhelming evidence of Binance knowingly facilitating transactions for designated terrorists, groups including Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and even Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They had traced specific transactions, identified accounts, and were prepared to present evidence that would forever brand Binance as the bank of choice for America's enemies. This was the ultimate checkmate. A civil fine for operating an unlicensed exchange is one thing. A criminal conviction for financing terrorism is an entirely different universe of pain. It meant Binance would be blacklisted globally, its executives would become international pariahs, and CZ himself would face the prospect of spending decades in a maximum security prison. Simultaneously, the Treasury Department tightened the economic screws. Their Office of Foreign Assets Control (OFAC) finalized its case, documenting nearly $900 million in transactions that illegally flowed between American users and those in sanctioned Iran. This wasn't just a technical violation. It was seen as a direct undermining of U.S. foreign policy. The message was clear. Binance had helped an enemy state evade the economic pressure campaign designed to curb its nuclear ambitions and regional aggression. The potential penalties were astronomical, not just in fines, but in the power OFAC had to place Binance on the specially designated nationals list, a move that would be a corporate death sentence, effectively cutting it off from the global financial system entirely. Inside the walls of Binance, the pressure was causing the empire to crack from within. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Key executives, seeing the writing on the wall, began to quietly exit the company. The legal and compliance teams, who had once been allegedly sidelined in favor of growth, were now in a state of perpetual crisis. The fortress of ambiguity that CZ had built was now a trap. With no official headquarters, he had no home country to appeal to for diplomatic protection. He was a man without a flag, a citizen of a digital nation that had no army and no embassy to defend him against the encroaching power of the American state. The psychological toll on CZ himself must have been immense. The man who once roamed the globe as the king of a borderless kingdom was now a hunted man. He became a virtual prisoner in the United Arab Emirates, one of the few countries without an extradition treaty with the United States, reportedly fearing that an Interpol red notice could be issued at any moment, leading to his arrest if he traveled. The illusion of being beyond the reach of the law had been shattered. He was now living in the shadow of the American justice system, waiting for the final blow to fall. The final act of the takedown was a masterclass in legal strangulation. The Department of Justice had CZ exactly where they wanted him, trapped, isolated, and staring down the barrel of an indictment so terrifying it threatened to obliterate not just his company, but his very freedom. Prosecutors held a weapon of unimaginable power, a fully prepared criminal case centered on terror financing. They could, if they chose, march into court and paint a picture of Binance as a willing accomplice to the world's most reviled organizations. A conviction on these grounds would have been a kill shot, resulting in decades of prison time for CZ and the complete and utter destruction of Binance's global reputation. But a messy public trial, even one with overwhelming evidence, carried risks. Juries can be unpredictable. The defense would undoubtedly try to frame CZ as an un-American tech visionary being unfairly targeted by a jealous U.S. government. An acquittal, however unlikely, would be a catastrophic embarrassment for the DOJ. The government's true objective was grander than simply jailing one man. The goal was to domesticate the entire crypto frontier, to make an example so brutal and so public that no other exchange would ever again dare to operate in the gray zones of the law. They didn't just want a conviction. They wanted a public surrender. They wanted to turn the industry's most powerful leader into a living symbol of their dominance, so they made an offer. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum, a carefully crafted surrender document that was both a lifeline and a public execution. The back-channel talks between Binance's fleet of elite, expensive lawyers and the cold, immovable federal prosecutors were a study in contrasts. One side argued, blustered, and sought leverage. The other side simply laid out the facts, the evidence, and the inevitable consequences of a refusal. They let the sheer weight of their case do the talking. The terms of the proposed plea agreement were staggering, designed to be the largest penalty ever levied against a financial technology company in American history. First, there was the money, a number so large it was intended to induce a state of shock, a colossal $4.3 billion. This was not a fine, it was a tribute. It was a punitive extraction of wealth meant to claw back years of illicit profits and to signal to the world that the days of consequence-free rule-breaking were over. The figure was a monument to the scale of Binance's transgressions, carefully broken down so that every agency involved got its pound of flesh. It included a $1.8 billion criminal fine from the Department of Justice, a further $1.8 billion in penalties from the Treasury's financial crimes enforcement network for systematic violations of anti-money laundering laws, and a $1.5 billion payment to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to settle their civil suit. But the financial penalty, as breathtaking as it was merely the price of admission to the next circle of hell. The core of the government's demand, the part that was non-negotiable, was for Changpeng Zhao himself to be sacrificed. The company could not just write a check and move on. The king had to be dethroned, publicly and shamefully. The ultimatum demanded that CZ personally fly to the United States, walk into a federal courtroom in Seattle, and plead guilty to a felony. He had to admit, before the world, that he had willfully violated the Bank Secrecy Act by failing to implement an effective anti-money laundering program. This wasn't a technicality. This was an admission that he, the leader, the visionary, the face of the crypto revolution, had personally overseen an operation that allowed criminals and terrorists to flourish. This was the death of the myth, the public recanting of the faith he had preached for years. The humiliation did not end there. As part of the deal, Changpeng Zhao was required to resign as chief executive officer of Binance, the empire he had built from a single white paper into a global financial juggernaut. This was the government's ultimate power play. They understood that CZ was Binance. His personality, his vision, and his relentless drive were the fuel that had powered its meteoric rise. By forcing him out, they were not just removing a CEO, they were decapitating the organization, ripping out its heart and soul. He would be permanently barred from holding any executive or operational role within the company ever again. The man who had once commanded a multi-billion-dollar fortune and moved markets with a single tweet would be cast out. A king in exile for Binance, the company. The terms were equally brutal. It would be forced to plead guilty to a slate of its own felony charges, conspiracy, operating an unlicensed money-transmitting business, and, most damningly, violating U.S. sanctions laws under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This was a permanent stain on its record, a criminal brand that would follow it forever. But the true subjugation came in the form of the government's final demand. Binance would be forced to submit to years of intrusive, inescapable government oversight. The plea deal mandated the installation of two independent monitors, one appointed by the Department of Justice and the other by the Treasury's FinCEN. These monitors would be granted unprecedented power. For up to 5 years, they would become the shadow rulers of Binance, embedded deep within the company's operations. They would have the authority to review all internal records, to scrutinize every transaction, to overhaul compliance procedures, and to report every finding directly back to their masters in Washington, D.C. The black box of Binance, the fortress of corporate ambiguity that had once been its greatest strength, would be pried open and its darkest secrets laid bare for its conquerors to see. Binance would no longer be a rogue offshore entity. It would become, in effect, a ward of the American state, a regulated financial institution operating under the constant, watchful eye of the very government it had spent years trying to outrun. For CZ, the choice was an agony. He could reject the deal and wage a hopeless war against the most powerful government on earth. This path was a gamble for vindication that carried the near certainty of corporate annihilation and the very real possibility of spending his remaining years in a federal prison. Or, he could submit, he could sacrifice himself to save his creation. He could accept personal disgrace to give Binance a future, albeit a future as a neutered and subservient entity. The relentless pressure, the looming threat of the terror financing charges, and the slow, methodical strangulation by the American legal system had left him with no other viable move. Cornered and checkmated, the king finally knelt. He agreed. To every term, the final confrontation was set. On November 21, 2023, Changpeng Zhao boarded a plane and flew from his sanctuary in the United Arab Emirates to Seattle, Washington, to surrender himself to American justice and face his public execution. The takedown, in all its brutal and calculated glory, was complete. The moment the news broke, it wasn't a ripple. It was a digital tsunami. At precisely 1:07 p.m. Pacific time, the court filings hit the public docket, and the internet exploded. The surrender of Changpeng Zhao was not a quiet affair. It was a global spectacle of humiliation, broadcast in real time across every trading desk, newsroom, and social media feed on the planet. For years, CZ had been an icon of defiance, a symbol of crypto's unstoppable momentum. In a single afternoon, that image was systematically dismantled and set ablaze for the world to see. The eruption began on X, the platform CZ had once used as his personal broadcast tower. Within minutes, the hashtags began to trend, each one a dagger in the heart of the Binance myth. Hashtag CryptoKingNeil's shot to #1 worldwide, a brutal, mocking summary of the day's events. It was followed by hashtag Binance surrenders and the stark, jaw-dropping hashtag $4 billion fine. The schadenfreude from crypto's long-suffering critics was immediate and overwhelming. Notorious crypto skeptics, who had been dismissed for years as bitter Cassandras, took a collective victory lap. They posted screenshots of the plea agreement, highlighting the most damning admissions, with captions like, "Told you so." Their feeds were a torrent of mockery, comparing CZ's fall to the downfall of a tin-pot dictator. A man who built an empire on a foundation of sand and was now watching the tide of reality wash it all away. But for the true believers, the millions who had followed CZ as their financial messiah, the reaction was a chaotic mix of shock, denial, and profound betrayal. The Flaw meme, once a symbol of unshakable faith, now became an object of ridicule. Some tried to cling to it, posting Flaw in the face of the overwhelming evidence, claiming CZ was a martyr, sacrificing himself for the good of crypto to end the government's war. But it was a desperate, hollow gesture. For most, the feeling was one of being utterly duped. This was the man who had told them to ignore the FUD, who had assured them that Binance was safe, that the allegations were baseless. Now, here he was standing in an American courtroom, head bowed, admitting that the FUD had been true all along. He had not only failed to protect them, he had actively misled them. Invented tweets captured the mood perfectly. "I lost everything in it. I moved to Binance because CZ said it was safe. Now this. Who can we even trust anymore?" Another read. "He told us to be strong and ignore the FUD while he was negotiating a surrender. It feels like a total betrayal." The community that CZ had built, the army that had once been his greatest shield, was now turning on him. The king had not only been dethroned by his enemies, he had lost the love of his people, and in the digital world, that is the only death that truly matters. This was more than just a legal defeat. It was the public execution of a persona. The image of the humble, hoodie-wearing genius was replaced by the stark reality of a convicted felon. The man who lived in the clouds, beyond the reach of any nation, was brought crashing down to earth in a drab Seattle courthouse, stripped of his power, his company, and his dignity. The total victory for the US government was not just in the plea deal, but in the complete and total destruction of the myth they had set out to dismantle. The age of Flaw was over. The age of accountability had begun. The digital firestorm was immediately followed by the cold, hard judgment of the global media establishment. The ink on the plea deal was barely dry when the world's most respected financial newspapers carved CZ's legacy into stone. The headlines were brutal, definitive, and echoed in newsrooms from New York to London to Tokyo. The Wall Street Journal ran a banner headline, "The $4.30 billion confession. Crypto's wild. West era ends with Binance's capitulation." It wasn't just news. It was the closing of a historical chapter. Bloomberg, the chronicler of global capital, was even more direct, from hoodie to handcuffs. How the US government broke Binance and its billionaire founder. And the New York Times, framing the narrative for the political world, focused on the darkest angle of the government's case, a haven for terrorists and criminals inside the plea deal that exposed Binance's willful blindness. Each headline was a nail in the coffin of CZ's public image, cementing the government's narrative as the official, undisputed history of events. While the media wrote his obituary, the architects of his downfall held a victory press conference. In Washington, D.C., it was a masterclass in projecting state power. Standing before a backdrop of American flags, the nation's top law enforcement and financial officials took to the podium, their faces grim and resolute. This was not a moment of gloating, it was a moment of solemn restoration. Attorney General Merrick Garland spoke first, his voice steady and severe. "Let me be clear," he began. "Binance's crimes are not the result of a simple failure to comply with the law. The company willfully chose to put profits ahead of its most basic legal obligations. In doing so, it became a critical financial hub for criminals, for sanctions evaders, and for terrorist organizations around the world. Today's historic penalties send an unmistakable message to the entire digital asset industry. If you serve customers in the United States, you must obey our laws. The Department of Justice will not hesitate to hold you accountable." He was followed by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who framed the victory in even starker terms. Binance turned a blind eye to its legal obligations in the pursuit of profit, she stated, her voice carrying the weight of the global financial system she represented. Its willful failures allowed money to flow to terrorists, cybercriminals, and child abusers through its platform. This action enforces the fundamental principle that financial institutions, including those in the crypto space, must prevent illicit funds from passing through their systems. We are protecting the integrity of the U.S. financial system and holding those who threaten it accountable. Finally, the CFTC chairman, Rostin Benham, the man whose agency had fired the first shot, delivered the final verdict on CZ's deception. For years, Binance knew they were violating our rules, yet they actively worked to keep money flowing and to conceal their violations. They were not ignorant of the law, they were contemptuous of it. The lies have been exposed, and the truth, found in their own words and messages, has prevailed. The contrast between this display of unified institutional power and the fate of Changpeng Zhao could not have been more stark. While they spoke of high principles and national security, he was just a defendant. The court proceedings were a portrait of personal annihilation. The once mighty CEO, who commanded an army of employees and the loyalty of millions, stood before a federal judge, humbled and quiet. He was no longer CZ, the crypto icon. He was defendant Zhao, speaking only when spoken to. His answers are quiet. Yes, Your Honor. The plea agreement meant he avoided the immediate terror of a trial on the terror financing charges, but his freedom was far from guaranteed. He was released on a $175 million bond, but he was not free. He was forced to remain in the United States, his global travels instantly curtailed. His fate now entirely in the hands of a judge who would decide his sentence in the coming months. The man who built an empire on the idea of borderless freedom was now a prisoner within America's borders, waiting to learn if he would be sent to a federal prison. The ultimate irony was complete. The disruptor who sought to make the system obsolete was now utterly and completely at its mercy. The collapse of the king sent shockwaves through the foundations of his kingdom. The immediate fallout for Binance, the company, was catastrophic. The departure of CZ was not just a change in leadership, it was a decapitation. His replacement, Richard Teng, a former regulator brought in to project an image of compliance, that was a competent and respected figure. But he was not CZ. He did not possess the founder's aura, the messianic charisma that had inspired religious devotion among users and employees alike. An immediate and brutal exodus of talent began. Senior executives, developers, and strategists who had hitched their wagons to CZ's star saw no reason to remain loyal to the new, government-chaperoned regime. They quietly updated their LinkedIn profiles and headed for the exits, seeking fortunes at smaller, less scrutinized rivals. The financial bleeding was even more severe. In the days and weeks following the plea deal, Binance witnessed a tidal wave of withdrawals. Traders and institutions, spooked by the criminal conviction and the specter of ongoing government oversight, pulled billions of dollars off the platform. The company's own token, BNB, which had been a cornerstone of its ecosystem, plummeted in value, wiping out billions in market capitalization. The message from the market was clear. The magic was gone. Binance, the renegade pirate ship that had once promised adventure and riches, was now seen as a captured vessel, chained to the dock of the US Treasury. Its market share, once seemingly unassailable, began to steadily erode as competitors like Coinbase, which had chosen the long, expensive path of regulatory compliance from the start, capitalized on the chaos, positioning themselves as the safe, regulated alternative. The broader crypto industry fell into a state of terrified paralysis. For years, other exchanges had operated in Binance's shadow, adopting a similar ask for forgiveness, not permission strategy on a smaller scale. They had watched the showdown between Binance and the US government like a spectator sport, secretly hoping CZ would win and secure their own freedom to operate outside the rules. His spectacular defeat was their nightmare realized. A wave of panic swept through the boardrooms of crypto companies around the world. Lawyers were put on speed dial. Compliance departments, long treated as back-office cost centers, were suddenly the most important teams in the company. The era of the gray zone was over. The message from the US government was no longer a warning, it was a verdict. You were either with them, or you were next. Exchanges that had previously courted US customers, through legal loopholes and offshore entities, rushed to implement stringent new controls, aggressively blocking American users and beefing up their anti-money laundering systems. The cost of doing business in the crypto world had just skyrocketed, and the price was total submission to the American regulatory framework. The ultimate victory for the United States, however, was not just the crippling of one company or the terrorizing of an industry. It was the successful reassertion of its own global dominance. The takedown of Binance was a geopolitical power play, a demonstration to the entire world that American law follows the American dollar, wherever it may flow. It was a clear signal to rivals like China and Russia, who might seek to use unregulated crypto channels to evade sanctions and project their own influence. The US had proven that it had the will and the capability to reach into the digital ether and impose its order. The case against Changpeng Zhao became a foundational moment in the history of internet governance, a precedent that established the principle that national sovereignty extends into cyberspace. The wild, lawless frontier that crypto had promised was being tamed, surveyed, and annexed into the empire of the old world. The revolution, it turned out, would be regulated. The final nail in the coffin was CSE's sentencing hearing. After months in legal limbo, he stood before the judge one last time. Despite prosecutors pushing for years in prison, he received a sentence of just 4 months. To some it seemed like a slap on the wrist, but they missed the point. The government had already won. The prison sentence was just an epilogue. The real victory was in the $4.3 billion fine, the forced abdication, the public humiliation, and the permanent subjugation of his empire. They hadn't just put a man in a cell. They had put an entire industry on a leash. The victory for the US government was absolute, but the most profound aftermath was not found in a courtroom verdict or a bank transfer receipt. It was the dawn of a new, stark, an inescapable reality for the entire crypto world. The era of the great domestication had begun. The industry, born in a cypherpunk fever dream of radical decentralization and anarchic freedom, was now being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the suffocating embrace of the establishment. The central, animating promise of crypto that it was a viable alternative to the traditional financial system was officially pronounced dead. It was now brutally clear that crypto would not replace the old world, but would instead be absorbed by it, forced to exist as a new, volatile and thoroughly neutered asset class, operating within the unforgiving confines of the very rules it was created to destroy. The first and most visible sign of this new era was the seismic shift in institutional power. While Binance was being ritually humiliated, the true conquerors, the old gods of finance, were patiently waiting to claim their prize. For years, the titans of Wall Street, gargantuan asset managers like BlackRock, Fidelity and JP Morgan, had watched the crypto circus from the safety of their glass towers. They were intrigued by the underlying technology but repelled by the chaos, the regulatory uncertainty, and the reputational stench of renegade characters like Changpeng Zhao. Saw an untamed land full of digital gold, but it was too lawless, too dangerous for their gilded clientele. The government's surgical takedown of Binance was the signal they had been waiting for. It was the cavalry clearing the frontier of outlaws, making it safe for colonization. And the colonists arrived in force. In a stunning display of power and timing, just as the dust was settling on Binance's surrender, these very institutions descended upon the crypto market. Their weapon was not a new token or a decentralized application, but the ultimate tool of financial assimilation. The spot Bitcoin ETF. This was the Trojan horse that brought Wall Street inside crypto's gates. It allowed ordinary investors, pension funds, and institutional clients to buy exposure to Bitcoin through the same safe, regulated brokerage accounts they used to buy stocks and bonds. This wasn't a revolution, it was a corporate takeover. The money, the power, and the control began to flow in an unstoppable torrent, from the hands of the hoodie-wearing disruptors to the pinstripe-suited asset managers who controlled trillions. The very institutions crypto was meant to render obsolete had become its new overlords. They didn't join the revolution. They bought it, repackaged it, and sold it back to the masses, taking a fee at every step. This hostile takeover triggered a cultural purge within the crypto world itself. The libertarian, anti-government ethos that had been the industry's lifeblood for a decade suddenly felt dangerously naive. The new kings of crypto were not charismatic founders broadcasting alpha on X. They were bland, risk-averse chief compliance officers and armies of corporate lawyers who spoke in the sterile language of legal disclaimers. The measure of a project's success was no longer its potential for disruptive growth, but the strength of its regulatory moat and its appeal to institutional allocate. The revolutionary dream of banking the unbanked and creating a peer-to-peer global economy was quietly euthanized, replaced by the far more pragmatic goal of getting a 1% allocation in a pension fund's portfolio. The very language of the industry was sanitized. WAGMI, we're all gonna make it, was replaced by KYC, know your customer. To the moon was supplanted by sober warnings of market volatility. The rebellious, chaotic energy was being systematically scrubbed away, replaced by the gray, predictable hum of corporate finance. This wasn't just a change in business models, it was a forced conversion, an exorcism of the industry's founding spirit. The collapse of the CZ myth had a chilling paralytic effect on the very soul of crypto innovation. The brutal efficiency of its takedown sent a terrifying message to every ambitious developer and visionary founder. There are lines you do not cross. The fear of regulatory retribution became a powerful cage, stifling experimentation with the more radical, world-changing possibilities of the technology. The idea of building a truly decentralized, leaderless, and anonymous protocol, the kind of project that could genuinely challenge the authority of the state, now seemed less like a noble goal and more like a suicide mission. Why spend years building a decentralized mixing service or a private digital cash system when the inevitable result would be a visit from the DOJ's National Security Division? A chilling new pragmatism took hold. Founders began to self-censor, neutering their own creations before they were even launched to avoid attracting the attention of the state. Ambitions became smaller, safer, and fundamentally less interesting. The focus shifted away from creating systems that could liberate individuals from state control and toward building applications that could be neatly integrated into the existing corporate and state apparatus. The space became less about building a new world and more about building slightly more efficient plumbing for the old one. The government's total victory over Binance had, in effect, drawn the final, uncrossable boundaries of acceptable innovation, creating a regulatory prison from which the industry would likely never escape. The message was clear: you can play with your digital tokens, but you will do so in our sandbox, by our rules, and you will never again pose a credible threat to our power. In the end, the aftermath was a grand and tragic story of inversion. The man who dreamed of building a borderless world found himself a convicted felon, trapped within the borders of a single, vengeful nation. The company that was built on the principle of opaque ambiguity was now living under the perpetual, humiliating, the microscope of government surveillance. The industry that was born to shatter the old financial order was now being systematically co-opted and consumed by it, its revolutionary fire extinguished. The ultimate victory was not simply that the US government had won its battle against Binance. It was that it had won the war for the future of money itself. It had successfully and brutally proven that no technology, no matter how clever its code or how passionate its followers, could ever truly exist beyond the reach and power of the sovereign state. The lesson was broadcast not just to the cowering crypto world, but to all future innovators in every field imaginable, from artificial intelligence to biotechnology. The empire is still the empire, and it will always find a way to enforce its laws and protect its interests. The wild, untamed digital frontier that had promised a new dawn of freedom had finally met its sheriff. And in this showdown, the sheriff had not just won, he had burned the rebel camp to the ground and salted the earth. The aftermath was a quieter world, a more orderly world, and a profoundly less revolutionary one. The rebellion was over. The state had won. When the dust of this titanic collision finally settles and the echoes of the headlines fade into history, what are we truly left with? The story of Changpeng Zhao and the spectacular fall of Binance is far more than just another lurid chapter in the volatile boom and bust history of cryptocurrency. It transcends finance, technology, and day-to-day politics. It resolves into something far more elemental, a timeless, instructive fable for the digital age, a dramatic moral lesson written in the ink of a $4 billion check and the ashes of a fallen empire. It is a story about the intoxicating poison of unchecked ambition, the blinding nature of hubris, and the brutal, unchanging realities of power. The first, and perhaps most potent, moral of this epic tale is a stark warning about the seduction of speed and the profound perils of believing your own myth. Changpeng Zhao was the ultimate apostle of the Silicon Valley ethos, pushed to its absolute and most reckless extreme: move fast and break things. His infamous internal mantra, "It is better to ask for forgiveness than permission," was not just a business strategy. It was the gospel of a new generation of technological revolutionaries, who saw rules as mere suggestions and regulations as tedious obstacles on the road to innovation. This philosophy worked with astonishing success. It fueled the creation of a global financial behemoth in less time than it takes most traditional companies to conduct a market study. He built a kingdom in the clouds, a borderless empire that, it seemed to live by its own laws of physics, accountable to no flag, no government, and no earthly authority. He flew closer to the sun of pure, unregulated capitalism than any tech founder before him, and for a glorious time, the entire world was mesmerized by his brilliant glow. But the parable of Icarus is a story in two parts. Those who fly too close to the sun inevitably get their wings melted. CZ's fatal flaw was not his visionary ambition. It was his towering hubris. He began to believe that the foundational rules of the old world laws written over centuries to curb the worst excesses of human greed and to protect societies from chaos really did not apply to him. He mistook the government's slow, deliberate, bureaucratic pace for weakness, and its institutional silence for ignorance or inaction. While he was waging a loud theatrical war of public relations on social media, using single-digit memes and defiant slogans to rally his followers, he fundamentally failed to understand the nature of the beast he was provoking. He believed he was in a debate club, when in fact he was locked in a cage with a predator that had been perfecting the art of the kill for over 200 years. The United States government is not a rival company to be outmaneuvered with a clever growth hack. It is a sovereign power with a nearly infinite capacity for patience and an absolute monopoly on legitimate force. While CZ was tweeting to dismiss the FUD, the prosecutors and agents at the DOJ, the Treasury, and the CFTC were doing something else. They were quietly, meticulously building a fortress of evidence. Brick by painstaking brick, they collected the receipts, they documented the chats, they flipped the insiders. They were not interested in winning the 24-hour news cycle. They were interested in winning the war. This story also serves as a brutal lesson in the clash between theatricality and authenticity. Changpeng Zhao was a master of corporate theater. He crafted a compelling narrative of a humble visionary fighting for the little guy. His black hoodie, his simple meme, his constant presence on social media, it was all part of a carefully produced performance designed to build a cult of personality. He sold his followers a dream, and for a long time the performance was so convincing that the dream felt real. But the United States government deals in a different currency, irrefutable fact. Their case against Binance was a masterpiece of anti-theater. It was dry, methodical, and built on the most authentic evidence imaginable, the protagonist's own words. The chat logs and emails were the ultimate rebuttal to the performance. They were a look behind the curtain, revealing that the humble servant, or the people, was, in the government's telling, a ruthless CEO who allegedly joked about his criminal clients and actively conspired to deceive regulators. The moral is clear and devastating. You can build a kingdom on a narrative, but that kingdom will collapse the moment it is confronted with an undeniable truth. Authenticity, in the end, is the only foundation that can withstand the pressure of real scrutiny. Ultimately, the fall of Changpeng Zhao is a reaffirmation of one of the oldest principles of civilization. The rule of law is not optional. It is the invisible operating system that prevents society from descending into chaos. The crypto revolution, in its purest form, was an attempt to write a new operating system, one where code was law. It was a beautiful and elegant idea, but it failed to account for human nature. The unregulated frontier that Binance and others created did not become a libertarian paradise. It became a hunting ground for the worst actors on the planet. It proved, once again, that without rules and a powerful authority to enforce them, the strong will inevitably prey upon the weak. The government's victory should not be seen as a simple triumph of the old guard over the new. It should be seen as the necessary assertion of a society's right to protect itself. It is a lesson that the foundational principles of justice, the need for transparency, the fight against illicit finance, the protection of national security are not outdated concepts that can be disrupted by a clever algorithm. They are the hard-won lessons of centuries of human experience. The story of CZ is not a tragedy about the stifling of innovation. It is a timeless drama about the consequences of hubris and the enduring power of order. It teaches us that in the final, ultimate showdown between the man who believes he is a god and the system that governs mortals, the system, in the end, almost always wins. Preparation will always defeat arrogance. Facts will always dismantle fiction. And the rule of law will always, eventually, tame the wild frontier. The epic fall of Changpeng Zhao and the complete subjugation of his Binance empire will be remembered as a seismic event, a defining moment in the history of the 21st century. This was never just a legal battle over financial regulations. It was a raw bare-knuckle war over the very future of money, the nature of power, and the soul of the internet itself. The old world empire struck back with the full force of its authority, and it proved, in no uncertain terms, that no digital fortress is ever truly impenetrable, and no titan of technology is so powerful that they are above the law. But now, the verdict of history is passed to you. This is where the story truly continues in the conversation we have right now. In the global debate that follows this stunning confrontation, what do you believe? Was the United States government's unprecedented action unnecessary and just campaign to protect the integrity of the global financial system, a righteous crusade to tame a lawless digital frontier that had become a playground for criminals and terrorists? Or was this something darker, a heavy-handed anti-competitive assault on true innovation? A jealous empire using its overwhelming power to crush a legitimate threat to its long-held financial dominance? We want to hear your voice. Drop your unfiltered thoughts and analysis in the comments section below. This is a debate that will define the next decade of finance and technology, and every perspective is a crucial piece of the puzzle. If you found this deep dive into the heart of the conflict compelling, and if you want to see more explosive political and financial showdowns brought to life with this level of detail, do us a huge favor. Smash that like button until it turns blue, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you are the first to know when we drop our next investigation. Sharing this video is the single most powerful way to support our independent analysis and to help us continue telling these critical stories. Every share helps this narrative reach a wider audience, ensuring that people understand the colossal forces battling for control behind the headlines. So, we leave you with one final monumental question. Now that the state has proven it can chain the beast of decentralized finance, what comes next? Will this brutal but decisive action lead to a safer, more mature, and ultimately more trusted crypto industry? Or has the revolutionary fire, the very soul of cryptocurrency, been extinguished forever? And speaking of tech emperors facing a public execution, if you think this story of a titan being humbled was intense, you have no idea what's coming next. We all think we know the story of Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse. We saw the memes, we heard about the billions lost, but that's the official version. We are about to take you inside the locked boardroom for the story you were never meant to see in our next video, the $36 billion scam, how Wall Street exposed Zuckerberg's metaverse failure. We'll put you in the room to feel the suffocating tension as Zuckerberg offers his arrogant defense. And then you'll hear the one brutal question from a Wall Street analyst that didn't just crater a stock. It destroyed a reputation and shattered the myth of a founder who thought he was untouchable. The full, unbelievable story is waiting for you. A link to the video has just appeared on your screen. Click it right now. You do not want to miss this. We'll see you there.